Dan Levine, as many of you know, is here at the Wilson Center, has been here for the last several months as a fellow of the Henry Luce program, scholarships for people studying religion and politics. Diego Avente needs no introduction to people here in the Washington community. He is at the International Forum for Democracy Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, a native of Paraguay, with a long political career in Paraguay and a distinguished record of writing and speaking on questions of democratic governance. I have not read this book yet. I have my copy reserved for me outside, so I'm not sure I can say much about the contents, except to say that the subject matter is indeed at the forefront of the study of democratic governance in Latin America. For some time, the scholarship on democratization has focused on questions of democratic quality, and particularly, I think, what most scholars consider its limitations, its deficits or shortcomings. The essential requirements for procedural democracy, free elections, universal suffrage within a basic framework of constitutional rights exist in most countries of the hemisphere, but even in countries where there is alternation and civil rights, scholars have emphasized that fundamental qualities of democratic governance are missing or severely compromised. These deficiencies include the uneven application of the rule of law, the absence of mechanisms of accountability, horizontal, vertical, the lack of respect for human rights, weak channels of representation, patterns of de facto discrimination against ethnic or racial minorities, and that has led to what one scholar has called a terminological babble in terms of the qualifiers, the adjectives that describe democratic quality, the so-called democracy with adjectives. So without leaving it necessarily on that pessimistic note, I'd like to also note that many scholars have emphasized the tremendous advances in democracy compared to 25 years ago, and that it's a long process of consolidation of what Philippe Schmitter has called real existing democracies. So with that brief note of introduction, turn the floor over to Dan Levine, thank him for his willingness to participate in this event, and also encourage you to visit the table outside the door after the seminar, in which you will be able to purchase copies of the volume.
We need the money.
There you go.
Thank you.
And you are going to live on your royalties, I'm quite confident. So.
Certainly hope so. Thank you very much. I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for giving me this opportunity to present some of the core ideas and findings of the book on the quality of democracy in Latin America that I recently co-edited with José Molina of the University of Zulia in Venezuela. I wish he could be here. In fact, he is conducting a similar forum this week at his home university. I also want to thank Diego Avente for agreeing to serve as a commentator. One note, you probably already noticed, there are no screens here. I'm one of the few people still around who doesn't use PowerPoint. So in the absence of slides and projections to serve as guidelines and to anchor attention, I'll just try to be as concise and clear as I possibly can. I'll try to outline the origins of this project and specify the operative definition we use in our analysis of quality of democracy, along with the broader theoretical perspective in which it's situated. The study of quality of democracy has become a crowded field lately, particularly in work on Latin America, so it's important for any new entry to justify itself. The current wave of democracy, which begins in the mid to late 1980s, is by general agreement one of the most consolidated and longest lasting in recent experience. These democracies, despite economic crises, institutional problems of the kinds that Cindy mentioned, have survived. Attention among scholars has shifted away from what was a predominant concern with transitions and conditions of consolidation to an effort to address the quality of these democracies. That is to say, the extent to which they live up to some ideal measure of what a democracy is or can or should be. How exactly that is defined is a matter of some contention in the field. There's a large body of work that addresses the issues more or less in terms of dichotomies. We have democracy or we have dictatorship. We have liberal or we have illiberal democracies. There's also a considerable literature that addresses minimal conditions for democracy, say in terms of a range of income levels or of sovereignty. There's a large group of studies that centers attention in general terms on freedom, like Freedom House, which most everyone uses some of their measures, which joins together elements of economic, religious, associational, political, and civil freedoms to get a ranking. And finally, maybe not finally, but finally in my list, there's a considerable literature such as the work by the UN Development Program and a recent effort by Mainwaring Scully and Vargas Culel, that identifies quality of democracy with governance, with the capacity of governments to deliver good policy results. All these are important, but in this book we take quite a different approach. Although we acknowledge and in some cases emphasize the importance of inequality and of some policy areas, and we emphasize responsiveness, the responsiveness of governments if citizen wishes is one of our dimensions, we believe that for analytical purposes it is important to maintain a distinction between the quality of political democracy, conceived of as a group of specifically political processes and procedures, from governance or effectiveness of government as manifest in good or bad policy. In our view, those who stress policy and governance conflate the quality of political process with policy results. Democracies can deliver good or bad or contested policies, say on economic issues, on sexuality matters, for example, but they're not thereby less democratic, and authoritarian regimes can sometimes deliver good policies without thereby acquiring democratic legitimacy. Our view of democracy and of the quality of democracy starts with an understanding that democracy is above all a matter of political processes and procedures. Further, that the effort to measure the quality of any democracy has to recognize that this is not well understood as an all or nothing proposition. Democracy is a multidimensional phenomenon, and so we identify a set of 5 dimensions. I'm going to mention these quickly, and I'm going to come back to them in a little bit. The 5 dimensions that we study are electoral decision, the quality of elections and quality of information, participation, accountability, responsiveness, and sovereignty. Those 5 dimensions, we try to measure them across the region, and I'm happy to say that in contrast to many collections of case studies, our authors actually pay attention to them also. The point to underscore here is that the overall understanding of the quality of democracy rests on an analysis of these 5 dimensions, each of which is a continuum. So any country could be strong on electoral decision, with free and fair and frequent elections, effective citizenship, open information, and the like, at the same time be quite weak on accountability, given difficulties and weaknesses in the institutions charged with ensuring accountability, such as judiciaries, ombudsmen, attorneys general, legislative oversight bodies. And in fact, this combination of good performance in elections with weak accountability is all too common. As we use the concept, the quality of democracy depends on the operation of processes whereby the population of a country or a district or a region selects and controls its government and influences public policy, and those elected really have the ability to govern. Before going any further, I want to note one caveat. There are obvious dangers to working with procedural models of democracy. The most notable of these is the danger of formalism, that is to say, confusing the existence of formal democratic rules and holding of elections with what may be low-quality reality. What makes and keeps the political process democratic in a meaningful sense is the extent to which access and participation by individuals and organized groups, directly or through some scheme of representation, is available on a relatively unhindered basis throughout the social order. This directs attention to the effective extension of citizenship, to conditions of organization and access to public life, access to information, as well as to formal institutions of political participation. Let me illustrate the importance of this point with brief examples from 2 of the case studies in this volume. I like them all, but I like these 2 in particular. In the study of Mexico by Claudio Holzner, the author shows in some detail how the pervasive inequality of Mexican society affects the nature of participation. The poor have only the vote, and they consider other forms of participation dangerous and risky, and the vote is a limited instrument of influence. And inequality also reinforces what he calls a self-enforcing, low-level equilibrium in which subnational authoritarian enclaves operate effectively to nullify accountability. So although there's been a transition to competitive electoral politics at the national level, the transition to a politics of accountability remains very incomplete. And just let me quote briefly from this. He says, while some have written about the persistence of authoritarian enclaves in Mexico, the word enclave understates just how pervasive, deeply rooted, and powerful authoritarian practices, institutions, and elites are in Mexico. Authoritarian legacies persist in a multitude of federal agencies, thrive in local and state-level institutions, and thoroughly permeate the criminal justice system, seemingly immune to pressures from electoral competition. Many of the most egregious flaws with democracy occur at the subnational level, where vote buying, official influence, official violence and repression, and the intimidation of journalists and opposition supporters are still common. These authoritarian practices have proven to be extremely resilient despite a strengthening civil society and significant democratic progress at the national level. A second and very different case is Bolivia. The author of the case study here, Martín Mendoza Botello, demonstrates in great detail how a set of institutional innovations flowing from the 1994 Law of Popular Participation, combined with a massive and effective decentralization and municipalization of the country in subsequent years, which created a whole bunch of new arenas and new opportunities for participation in voting, elected mayors, elected councilors, elected prefects, all of which did not exist before. All this was combined with incentives to participate in innovative ways of involving civil society in local and regional government. I can provide details of this if people like in questions. The result has been to elicit and to nurture the emergence of local and regional leaders from hitherto unrepresented groups, making the municipal arena and related social movements into a training ground for future regional and national leaders. All this is very visible in the social movements that undergird the career and the political party of Evo Morales, the current president, and they were fully expressed in the Constituent Assembly of 2006 in Bolivia, which we can also talk about. So our general approach, as I said, is built around these 5 dimensions, and we work at it with data from across the region. The authors of our 8 case studies also work at it. Let me just say something briefly about the case studies, and then I will talk about the dimensions. We have 8 case studies: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Mexico. They range, obviously, from countries where democratic experience began only late in the last century, like Nicaragua, where a socially democratizing revolution was followed by truly competitive elections in 1990 and thereafter, to others like Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, with lengthy democratic trajectories marked by breakdown and restoration. Of the 3 cases our authors analyze, only 3 of them show continuity of civil institutions. Mexico, which has moved, as mentioned, from a hegemonic one-party state to competitive democracy at the national level. Colombia, which has maintained institutional continuity in a context of severe and extended violence that undermines accountability. And Venezuela, which is now in the 2nd decade of a revolutionary process that, in my view, has diminished institutions, undercut the transparency of public processes and accountability of leaders while dramatically re-centralizing and concentrating power in the executive. And Bolivia, which, as I indicated, has moved from an elite-driven, limited, and rather shaky set of institutions to create some really innovative forms of participation that have changed the substructure of politics. So now I'm ready to return to the elements of our working definition of democracy and quality of democracy. I'm keeping an eye on the clock as I go here. We situate our scheme in a tradition of scholarship that conceives of democracy in procedural terms and centers attention, therefore, on political processes and how they operate. Like many in the field, we draw on the insights provided by Robert Dahl, and I was a student of Dahl, so 1,000 years ago. In numerous foundational works, Dahl outlines the bases of democratic politics. And I just want to quote to you one passage from a very good book of his that doesn't get enough attention called How Democratic is the American Constitution? In case you don't know, the answer is not as democratic as you think, right? Dahl says, quote, "To be fully democratic, a state would have to provide rights, liberties, and opportunities for effective participation, voting equality, the ability to acquire sufficient understanding of policies and their consequences, and the means by which a citizen body could obtain adequate control of the agenda of government policies and decisions. As we now understand the ideal, in order to be fully democratic, a state would have to ensure that all, or at any rate most adult residents under its jurisdiction would possess the rights of citizenship. There is no need to describe here the basic political institutions of a democratic country, but it should be obvious that just as in the ideal, so too in actual purpose, democratic government presupposes that its citizens possess a body of fundamental rights, liberties, and opportunities. These include the right to vote in the election of officials in free and fair elections, to run for elective office, to free expression, to form and participate in independent political organizations, to have access to independent sources of information, and to have rights to other freedoms and opportunities that may be necessary for the effective operation of the political institutions of large-scale democracy." I wish we could all write as clearly as Dahl, but that's him. So from Dahl, we can say that in democracies, the following conditions should apply. Elections should be free, fair, and frequent, hopefully competitive. Government is effectively in the hands of those elected, no shadow regimes. There's freedom of expression. There's freedom of organization, and assembly and associations are substantially autonomous of government. Citizens are free to vote and stand for office, and there's open access to information, and citizenship is broadly inclusive with universal adult suffrage and no discriminatory barriers to electoral or political participation, for example, by gender, by race, by property, by education. These considerations yield these 5 dimensions which I mentioned. and I'm going to go over them one by one now. I won't go into measurement details here. This is done in great detail in Chapter 2, although I can try to respond to questions about that. But I would like to spend some time on what they're intended to capture. Electoral decision, the requirement that elections be free, fair, and frequent and competitive, and that they lead to the designation of officials that have real power to act, is central to any definition of political democracy. Competition is important, but it actually isn't enough. Other elements we consider are the distribution of cognitive resources through education. That is to say, does the population have the basis for an informed judgment? And we look at the measure of secondary education. Relative access to information, the media, the press, the quality of electoral institutions. This is a subject of growing interest lately. The national and regional commissions that manage elections, as I'm sure you know, have a mixed record. Not surprisingly, where democracies are strongest, they are well established and independent, and where they're weaker, their impartiality and equitability of these institutions has been challenged. One final element, which is of particular interest in one of the cases, concerns the ability of persons to stand for office. In the case of Venezuela, which again I can discuss later, there have been waves of disqualifications of leading potential candidates, mostly of the opposition, just before elections, mostly on administrative grounds, and this does affect the right of people to stand as candidates. So the dimension of electoral decision includes formal aspects of competition along with attention to the effective conditions of organization, competition, information, and access. The dimension of participation includes both participation in formal political processes like voting or standing for office, and we have a measure of participation in political parties and groups. The basic idea is that the greater the participation, the higher the probability that government and its decisions will be responsive to the will of the people. And we look, under this heading, we look at the proportion of eligible adults who do turn out to vote. We look at the question of barriers and ease of access to registration, and we pay a lot of attention to the increase in the sheer number of offices and institutions open to election. That is to say, the opportunities to vote. We also include in this national and regional referenda. Federal and decentralized systems have something of a built-in advantage in here, since there are more opportunities to vote, and decentralization and municipalization also offer more opportunities to vote. Participation is, of course, mostly through representation, but we and our authors also look at instances of direct democracy and participatory democracy. Some of them work well. In many cases, it's been difficult to shield them from the danger of state and leadership manipulation. Accountability, the third dimension. Accountability is a much discussed and very controversial topic. Overall, obviously, it refers to a range of institutional and social means for making public officials, elected and appointed, subject to control and possible sanction. Accountability can be formal or informal. Formal includes laws, administrative norms, independent or semi-independent offices charged with ensuring accountability, attorneys general, judiciaries, legislative oversight committees, public defenders, electoral commissions, ombudsmen. There's a story in today's New York Times which says the former president of Guatemala is acquitted of corruption. No one ever thought he'd be convicted, but it's a sign of a little bit of a weakness in accountability there under the judiciary. Most of these institutions, in many cases, suffer from inadequate power or resources to carry out their role. It's an empirical question. In some places it's better, in some places it's worse. Along with much of the literature, we distinguish three kinds of accountability. Horizontal accountability, exercised by elements within the government, specifically charged with review and oversight. Rule of law and sanctioned judgments, like corruption inquiries, impeachments, those are the kinds of issues where we find this. Vertical accountability, in which officials are subject to the electoral process, and we take a look at the length of term of governments and the number of the extent to which they are in fact voted on. And social accountability, following Perusotti and Smolovitz, which is an excellent book. We talk about the capacity of social movements to mobilize public opinion to judge and sanction officials. There are some innovations which I've learned about by reading the case studies in this book, such as the acción de tutela provided for in the 1991 Colombian Constitution that falls somewhere in between. The acción de tutela allows individual citizens to claim judicial redress against public officials or persons representing public offices. The decisions are to be rendered quickly, within 10 days, and recent surveys show that many Colombians are familiar with this and they find it to be effective, and they use it often in cases of corruption. Responsiveness, the term suggests this refers to the extent to which governments form and implement policies that citizens want. The idea is that in contrast to the role of political caciques, or the notion of delegative democracy that O'Donnell has elaborated, we want to get at the fact that officials are responsive, and we get at it through a question about whether people think their vote makes a difference for the future. And the last dimension is sovereignty, sovereignty. This is not often included in studies of quality of democracy except as a limiting or minimal condition, the need for a country to at least have formal sovereignty. We include it in order to have a measure, even approximate, of the extent to which those elected are not puppets, the extent to which they're not wholly constrained by non-democratic forces. And we look at this in terms of the impact of the external debt and a measure of control over the military. Both of them are sources of notable constraint over sovereignty. And as I'm sure you know, with respect to control over the military, there has been substantial progress in these years. Time presses. I've now used 20 minutes. I don't want to use more than another 5 or 8. I want to... Well, thank you. I'll use even more then. I just want to offer you a brief overview of the findings as a whole. In a region as diverse as Latin America, regional averages can be quite misleading, but a few general trends do stand out. The most notable area of democratic strength are found in the dimensions of electoral decision and sovereignty. Positive results on electoral decision on the whole are rooted in the very holding of free and impartial elections, the extent of public education, the extension of publication, and the diffusion of access to alternative sources of information, linked to the development of open and accessible public spaces for organization. There is a great book on Nicaragua by Leslie Anderson and Lawrence Dodd, which makes a big point of the development of public space for people as a part of the democratization of that society. Good results in sovereignty, despite the debt, are sustained by the evidence of increasing the extensive and secure civilian control of the military. The chapter on Chile at the end has a list of particular decisions which have been taken since the restoration of democracy in Chile, and one of the most notable is restoration to the executive of the ability to change the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, that is to say, grow civilian control of the military. There are, of course, counterexamples. Venezuela is one, I think, perhaps Mexico with the drug wars, and in general, the power of armed groups in Colombia are a counterexample, but on the whole, this has been an area of progress. Among our dimensions, the most notable democratic deficit is clearly in the area of accountability. Even in cases like Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile, which generally have high rankings on the quality of democracy, they share the top ranking that Freedom House authorizes. Accountability remains a weakness. It's a weakness across the board. It's a weakness within countries where, as I mentioned, in the case of Mexico, the institutions charged with accountability often lack the resources and power to do their job. And informal social institutions like journalists are often intimidated or bought off. The case study on Mexico mentions that Mexico is one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists now, more dangerous than Iran or Afghanistan, which is Iraq or Afghanistan, and that's saying something. This is not to mention cases like Venezuela, where the judiciary and other institutions have been completely gutted of independence, or more complex cases like Colombia, where the threat of violence has undercut the effective rule of law, but at the same time in Colombia, there's considerable surge in societal activism, particularly around citizen-generated peace movements, which have been very active in the last 10 or 15 years. The overall figures and the individual case studies point to accountability as the most serious problem for quality of democracy. For this reason, it's important to insist on the need to reinforce institutions and practices that monitor and control the exercise of power. Let me give you one example that we take up at some length in the last chapter. Facing the challenges of consolidating new democracies in the 90s, there was a lot of scholarship that stressed the importance of adopting electoral systems that would increase the likelihood that presidents would have a legislative majority. Mainwaring and Shugart, Carey, all of them are pushing an institutional design that was intended to avoid deadlock that might undermine democracy, as it's argued it undermined democracy in Peru in the 90s, although I think that's a little simplistic. But in any event, in light of what I've argued about accountability, there's a problem with this. Efforts to reinforce governability by increasing the likelihood of a presidential majority at the same time undermines the possibility of legislative oversight, which is one form of horizontal accountability. When priorities evolve beyond mere survival and improvement to the quality of democracy, it makes sense to shift the focus of efforts to reinforce accountability to provide for greater autonomy for legislatures and judiciaries, to give agencies like judiciaries, ombudsmen, or public defenders more resources and power, and to provide for the defense of the press and freedom. Salvador Martí, who wrote the chapter on Nicaragua, We have several Spanish authors, several Latin American authors, and a bunch of gringos in this book, like me. Salvador Martilla notes another problem for accountability in Nicaragua, which is repeated, constant changes of the rules of the game, so that people don't actually know what rule they're applying, and they stop trying to apply any particular rule. And I've also mentioned the problem of subnational authoritarian enclaves. I do want to note one bright spot in the area of participation. One of the issues that we tried to address was representativity. This is not only in the technical sense of whether seats are allocated in reasonable proportion to votes. In most cases, the operation of proportional representation systems is in force, and that helps, although there are instances of gerrymandering and overweighting of some votes, like rural votes. That remains an issue, as it does here in the US. I was an observer, an official observer of the legislative elections in Venezuela last September, and I discovered that the word gerrymandering has become a common noun in Venezuela. Everybody talks about gerrymandering and says, you have been gerrymandeado, and it was a big issue in the elections, and it worked to the advantage of the government. Everybody even knew who Elbridge Gerry was, which surprised me. There's another element of representativity that we looked at, however, which is in terms of gender. It's possible to say that with respect to legislative representation by gender, there's been considerable effort in the region to promote the participation of women and to limit forces that inhibit a role for women in political leadership. The primary tool used for this has been the application of gender quotas. In lists of candidates, 11 of the countries we examine here have some kind of gender quota system, and the results are visible in the growing parliamentary presence of women. It's especially visible in countries like Costa Rica or Argentina, where such quotas have more tradition and greater institutional backing. And we've also, of course, seen the election of women to the presidency in a number of recent cases: Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Brazil. So there is some progress on that front. One element that doesn't appear in our index, but is worth thinking about, which has a visible impact in more than a few cases, is violence, and it is mentioned in the last chapter. Although the big civil wars are mostly over, the persistence of violence, whether through drug trafficking, insurrection, police impunity, or ordinary criminality, has a debilitating effect on institutions and on the capacity of citizens to participate freely in social and political life. And in some cases, in Colombia or now in parts of Mexico, the persistence of violence has effectively removed control of the central state over substantial portions of the national territory. I don't want to end on a low note, so let me close by emphasizing that the region's demonstrated strength in electoral decision and sovereignty, control over the military, offers a promising start for the future, a base that can be reinforced to the extent that free and fair elections can be maintained and extended to all levels of the political system. Strengthening decentralization, along with efforts to reduce barriers to organization, open access to information, and extend the limits of citizenship would further strengthen this. If you look at the cases, it becomes apparent there's both light and shadow here, but on the whole, the balance is promising. There's one last point that I would like to make in closing. According to my HEFA, I am on schedule here. In studies of this kind, there's a tendency to play the rankings game. I didn't bring along a PowerPoint chart, so we can't do it here, but everyone always wants to know how his or her country is ranked. How does it stack up against others? Why is Peru ranked just above or below some other country? Let me say something about the overall rankings and then argue for looking inside the rankings. Most studies of indices that offer rankings on quality of democracy, we do, Freedom House does, Polity 4 does, a lot of people do, are broadly comparable. After an extensive review and critique of many studies of democracy, Gerardo Munk and Verkuylen conclude that none of them is very satisfactory, that there's a high intercorrelation between them all, which suggests that they are, despite differences in conceptualization or measurement or aggregation, they're tapping the same underlying reality. And if that's the case, one can ask, well, why do we need another index? Aside from the fact that we wanted to publish a book, we're academics, right? As I've said, the index of quality of democracy that we present is not about democracy or freedom in general, but it's centered on political processes based on concepts specifically directed at the quality of democracy. For this reason, it moves debates beyond simple dichotomies to measured understanding of the multidimensional character of these democracies. Democracy can clearly take hold first in some dimensions, like electoral decision, voting opportunities, an interest that can be expanded and multiplied. In the same way, democracy can weaken and decay in some cases, like accountability or sovereignty, or the persistence of authoritarian enclaves that can create the possibility of a political system rotting from the bottom up. Our index centers creates clear distinctions between cases that Freedom House or Polity 4 rank the same. Let me just give you one example. The same three countries always appear at the top of these rankings: Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica. Indeed, Freedom House has them tied for the top spot. There's a broad group of middle-ranked cases: Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Panama, Dominican Republic, followed by several lower clusters. If all indices are the same, why do we need another one? Our response is that our results provide a nuanced understanding, and because we look at these 5 dimensions, we get a more differentiated ranking as well. In our analysis, for example, Uruguay is considerably above Chile and Costa Rica in the overall quality of democracy. This is so because it outranks the other 2 on 4 of our 5 dimensions. It does so substantially on participation, accountability, and responsiveness. Uruguay also stands out for the cognitive resources of the population, with what is essentially universal secondary education, has the highest level of electoral participation in the region, and outranks all countries on responsiveness, affirming the high confidence that its citizens have in the efficacy of their vote or shaping the politics of their country. This is just one example that I've drawn on here, but I think it suggests that our index provides a greater depth and specificity that allows us to see strengths and weaknesses together, and this way points to a more nuanced understanding of areas where institutional reform is needed and possible. I think I'll just stop here and leave space for Diego.
Thank you very much. How much time do I have, Cindy?
15, maximum 20.
All right. Thank you. Well, to begin with, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center for inviting me to participate in this very important, interesting panel, Cindy. And I would like to thank Professor Dan, for inviting me to comment on this very important piece of scholarship. Before the third wave of democracy, the attention of scholars and practitioners alike was focused on the process of democratization or re-democratization. There was a general, if underlying, assumption that once authoritarian regimes were defeated and replaced by democratic ones, the lot of the peoples and countries would dramatically improve. Later, the focus shifted to the study of democratic consolidation, highlighting that not all democracies were progressing at the same rhythm. They were not all alike. And finally, early in the 21st century, when the predictions about the many virtues of democracy did not materialize as easily or as rapidly as expected, the focus shifted once again to what has been known as the studies of the quality of democracy. Thus, from the early 2000s on, a number of scholars began to address this issue in articles and books. In the middle of the decade, considering the existing literature limited in one or another respect, Dan Levine and José Molina joined together with a very distinguished group of scholars to produce this very fine piece of scholarship, which I consider an indispensable tool for those of us interested in the fate of democracy in Latin America, but elsewhere as well. The book includes 3 chapters by the editors, one addressing theoretical issues, one working out the operational dimensions of the concept, and a final and drawing conclusion. In addition, it has the case studies that I will not mention because Dan already made reference to them. All chapters address the guiding questions posed by the editors, making the book a truly comparative exercise. And you did mention that, and that is not an easy task for editors. In the interest of time, however, and the breadth of our discussion, my comments and reflections will be centered on the chapters by the editors, that is, in the general questions, rather than on the specifics of the findings of each country. What quality of democracy is and is not. The book begins with a useful and a much needed theoretical overview of the concept of quality of democracy and of the operationalization of the concept. A first and essential distinction is the one between the quality of democracy and the quality of democratic performance. There has been a tendency in the late 1990s and early 2000s to conflate both concepts, and this blurring of the line have only brought about a lot of confusion and ambiguity. When Dan was working on this, I was working on a similar project without knowing Dan's project, and Dan's without knowing my project. I also thought that that was an important distinction. However, I chose to concentrate on democratic performance as opposed to the quality of the democratic process. But this is a very, very important theoretical distinction that is being made here in this book, and it is extremely useful. A second crucial point has to do with the definition of democracy. Adhering to a procedural definition of democracy, Levine and Molina focus on the political process itself, the authoritative allocation of values, as David Easton put it almost 60 years ago. As they correctly argue, a procedural definition has the advantage of its analytical precision and portability. Democracy is defined as a, quote, system of representation with universal adult participation according to open and equal rules. That requires, and does imply, inclusive citizenship, free and open access to the political arena, to all groups and individuals, and transparent rules, and freedom of information and organization, and formal and informal means of ensuring accountability. Thirdly, Levine and Molina define the focus of their inquiry as the level of quality of any democracy determined by the extent to which citizens can participate in an informed manner in processes of free, fair, and frequent elections, influence the making of political decisions, and hold those who govern accountable. The quality of democracy is thus a multidimensional continuum, and its measurement tantamount to assessing, in those famous two-dimensional rendition, assessing how democratic a polyarchy is, or how close a polyarchy is to that beautiful corner, the northwest corner, to use Guillermo O'Donnell's famous phrase. Having dealt with competent... Seattle. Having dealt with quite competently with a number of conceptual hurdles, the author moved on to operationalize the concept. The operational dimensions are 5: electoral decisions, participation, accountability, responsiveness, and sovereignty. Again, I was going to elaborate a little bit on them, but Dan already did it, so I'm going to skip that part of my presentation. However, I do want to underline sovereignty. Sovereignty, the last variable, taps the extent to which the government enjoys autonomy vis-à-vis international actors in managing the economy and vis-à-vis the military in enforcing military policies. And this is really an innovation in the sense that I haven't seen this dimension included, in at least in recent studies on this matter. The Index of Quality of Democracy and its implications. With these 5 dimensions, Levine and Molina construct an index of quality of democracy for circa 2005. The index shows that Uruguay stands at the top, followed by Costa Rica, Chile, Argentina, and Mexico, all 4 of them within decimals of each other. Guatemala stands at the bottom. 8 countries, the 5 already mentioned, plus Panama, Dominican Republic, and Brazil, rank above the average. The remaining 9 countries rank below the average. The index shows not only how each country ranks, but also their relative strengths and weaknesses. For example, most countries rank consistently well in terms of electoral decisions and sovereignty, especially in civilian control of the military. In contrast, most countries rank poorly in accountability, especially, but also in participation. And this is a very surprising finding because it is so in spite of the apparent strength of social movements of many stripes. The lowest average score for all 17 countries is in accountability, and by far. Moreover, for each country considered individually, the lowest score again is in accountability. So this indicates a serious across-the-board democratic deficit. Yet, as I will elaborate later, the data available to measure accountability requires, in my view, some further discussion. Moreover, and from a practical point of view, this raises an important question, as the authors argue. In order to consolidate the newly democratic regimes and ensure governability, the tendency in the 1990s has been to strengthen the power of the president. Yet, by accomplishing this goal, the control mechanism of the legislature were weakened, and so was the level of horizontal accountability. Again, Dan just mentioned this. This has even rise to what O'Donnell has called the legative democracies, a tendency that, if anything, has increased dramatically over the last decade, and especially the last years. Yet, these tendencies should be seen in context, because the fact that one has a strong legislature doesn't necessarily translate into stronger horizontal accountability. One has to do an analysis of the makeup of the legislature. For example, if the legislature is made up mainly of more than parties, tribes, and caciques, if it is that are political machines that are not strongly linked to any social or economic constituency in society, but rather to that machine that is in the business of getting power not as a mean to something, but as the end in itself, then the accountability that those strong legislatures could exercise on the executive leave much to be desired, because the kinds of demands and the kinds of questions and the kinds of hurdles that they may eventually put have to do mainly not with the well-being of the population as a whole, but with satisfying very, very specific demands. It is I would call it pork accountability. To just try to find a way of saying it in short. So I think that is something that we have to look at. Wisely enough, the author distinguished between the type of arrangement that may be necessary in emerging and new democracies, stronger executive power, from that appropriate for more mature and consolidated democracies. So the same prescription or recipe is not true at all moments in the historical evolution of the countries. Also, the author finalized by pointing out priority areas for further research and action. And not surprisingly, the challenge of accountability figures at the top of the list, followed by strengthening diverse type of participation. Questions. Panelists, commentators are not only to praise truly very good books, and such as this one, but also dwell on the questions they may raise. Hence, allow me to move on to the few that, in my view, this book does. The first one has to do, when not, with the operationalization of the concepts. I agree with the need to have a restricted and limited definition of what quality of democracy is. I fully agree. And I like the dimension of sovereignty. But adding the dimension of sovereignty, a highly original contribution, by the way, raises two questions. On the one hand, to what extent can one consider debt levels an indicator of economic sovereignty in this exercise, a dimension of the political process? To what extent debt levels is a dimension of the political process? Is it not instead the result of good or bad economic policies, and therefore an indicator of democratic performance rather than quality of democracy? On the other hand, civilian control of the military, the other indicator of sovereignty, is indeed vital. But if one is to include this dimension, why not bring in also measures of stateness? After all, the strength of the state in terms of control of the territory, effective bureaucracy, regulatory capabilities is just as important to gauge the extent to which citizens influence the making of political decisions. For example, in his chapter on Mexico, Claudio Holzner points out that, and I quote, "Many of the weaknesses of democratic rule in Mexico do not have their origin in faulty rules of the game, but in institutional weaknesses within the Mexican state that makes the implementation of those rules inconsistent, unpredictable, and in some cases, non-existent." That's one point. The second point I'd like to raise is a relative weakness of the indicators of horizontal and vertical accountability. And this is a problem we all have when we need good sources of good data. For horizontal accountability, the indicator is the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International. Without denying that corruption does reflect the ability of institutions to control each other, one wonders if the existence of other institutional and independent instances of control or lack of control should not be included too. I'm thinking here mainly of the controllership and the ombudsman. As for vertical accountability, the indicator chosen is the length of the term of elected officials, generally 4 or 5 years, except for Mexico, which is 6, and the fairness of the elections. Again, one wonders whether to have elections every 4 as opposed to 5 years indeed makes such a big difference in terms of vertical accountability. A third question that strikes me as wanting is the lack of inclusion of some indicator of the rule of law in the sense of enforcement of the rule of law, or what we call in Spanish, imperio de la ley as opposed to Estado de Derecho. After all, how can citizens influence political decisions or hold those in positions of power accountable if the laws are applied de acuerdo a la cara del cliente, according to the face of the plaintiff? This could be seen as a general symptom of the weakness of the state, along the lines of the argument of Holzner, but most observers would agree that the enforcement problem is to a large extent linked to corruption, influence peddling, and a general bias against the poor and the disadvantaged. Fourthly, observers may read with some skepticism the ranking, and you mentioned that, Dan, the ranking of 4 of the top 5 countries. The distance between the overall scores of I'm leaving Uruguay aside, I fully agree with that. The distance between the overall score of Costa Rica, Chile, Argentina, and Mexico are negligible. That such be the case between Chile and Costa Rica seems quite plausible, but that Argentina and Mexico be part of the same league and rank below only by decimals raises some questions. For example, according to a recent study published by UNDP and the OAS, between 2002 and 2007, a 5-year period coinciding roughly with the study, Argentinian presidents resorted to constitutional decrees, laws approved without going through Congress, in 382 occasions, beating even Menem, who used it 249 times in 10 years. They used it in 5 years, 382 times. Menem used it 249, but in 10 years. Chile never used it in the 2000-2007 period, and Costa Rica needs that the measure be approved by Congress in a specified period of time, while Mexico has a restriction that allows it to use it only for commercial matters, and it should be included in the budget law of the next year. So it has to be eventually approved by Congress. Surely this speaks squarely to the paucity of good comparative data available to scholars, such as Levine and Molina. This scarcity makes the construction of indices a risky, although necessary, task. Thus, I guess a caveat in this case is in order. Much more work in developing comparative political indicators is needed, and this would be ideal if this had been a graduate seminar. So tell students, go get better data on these dimensions. Fifthly, the distinction between national and subnational dimensions of the quality of democracy that Dan made in the book and in his presentation is fundamental. It would be useful, if not easy, to incorporate this dimension in the index in a second edition of the book, which I hope Dan and José will endeavor to produce. In conclusion, because I'm running out of time, Dan Levine and José Molina have produced a very fine piece of scholarship. The theoretical and conceptual chapters are solid and very useful. The country chapters are illuminating. And the index, an indispensable tool for comparative analysis and for developing a research agenda. The only one of its kind, as far as I know. And I am familiar with the Mangorin and Scully, but then as Dan said, the Mangorin and Scully just published is an index that includes both quality of democracy and quality of democratic performance. The index on only quality of democracy, this is the only one, and it's extremely useful. This book, because of its theoretical elegance and empirical rigor, should be required reading for democracy scholars and practitioners. Both will find in it a valuable source of information, debate, and guidance. As Gerardo Munk rightly states in the back cover of the volume, this book moved the debate forward, and I would add substantially. I already read it, and I have my copy. I strongly recommend you all to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Wonderful. I'm tempted to invite Dan to reply to the critiques, but I think it's much more important to invite your questions and comments, and then allow Dan, perhaps in responding, to weave his comments on Diego's comments into the presentation. We'll group some questions. Let's start with José Raúl. We'll just move around the room. So let's go here. Welcome.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you to the presenters for a wonderful exposition, a very clear one in spite of the absence of PowerPoint, as Dan was saying. I just want to take up a point that Diego made and kind of asked the panelists to flesh it out a little further, and it had to do with this whole explanation of sovereignty in terms of the absence of economic pressures and the whole question of the debt. But to take a point that Diego made, which is that in fact, the notion of economic sovereignty is one of the things that in some parts of Latin America has been used recently to go into some of the more egregious or lesser democratic practices in terms of rule of law and respect of property rights and these kinds of things, right? So the idea that we're doing this for economic sovereignty. Again, this might be a matter of, as you said, of democratic performance as opposed to democracy itself. But even if we're taking debt levels, and considering that the United States now has a huge debate on its own debt levels, by that measure, nobody is very democratic in that sense in terms of how those things pressure countries. So I just wonder if you could flesh that out a little bit further, what you mean by this term.
Thanks. Daniel, also congratulations on a really good presentation. I also want to press you a bit on this.
Richard, let me just ask, can please identify yourself because we're videoing whatever.
Richard Feinberg, visiting scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Dan, also I want to pressure you a little bit on this division you're making basically between politics on the one hand and socioeconomics on the other, or between process and performance. You seem to be returning to a single disciplinary approach. Your emphasis on Dahl, on pure politics, on pure power relations. This seems to be a criticism, and this is what I want to see if you would agree. This seems to be a criticism, really, of the recent work by UNDP, by Latino Barometro, in which they use the word quality continually, really, to refer to socioeconomic outputs. Would you go so far as to say that outputs don't matter? Are you saying that it's pure politics that we're interested in focusing on, even if it produces economic depression, massive inequality, et cetera, that the socioeconomic results are insignificant entirely? How far are you prepared to go in this disciplinary division? Thank you.
Thank you. Alfredo Rodriguez, Inter-American Development Bank. I just wanted to question, I found very interesting. I have not read the book, but I look forward to the dimension you mentioned on sovereignty. And my question relates to the fact that maybe are we missing the big elephant in the room, sovereignty, meaning the threat to sovereignty coming from the drug traffickers. You mentioned the military, and I think the region overgrew that. In your own ranking, everybody was actually high in the rule of the civilian authority over the military. Really the threat to sovereignty, the way I see it in many countries, comes from drug trafficker. As a Colombian, I find it a bit euphemistically to call it violence. I think it has a name, drug traffickers.
One more on this side, and then we'll return to the panelists. Go ahead.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm Guillermo Coches, Ambassador of Panama to the OAS, a politician for 45 years, elected twice to Congress. I think the principal weakness of our democracy systems are the lack or the absence of ethical values of politicians that you have not mentioned. That probably the result, we see the result in Venezuela, in Ecuador, and in Nicaragua, and Bolivia, and that probably we will see the result in other countries. For many of the politicians, politics have become a business, and the power, they use the power without any kind of limitations. For example, you mentioned good free elections, but what happened if on the day of the elections everything is free? But what happened before? The governments use a lot of resources to influence voters without any kind of control, or the candidates buy the votes of the people, and that's continued in our countries, and that's what I said. That's a problem that affect everything. For example, accountability, because power is to get the power. I use all the means because I win the elections and I have the right to do whatever I want. Thank you.
I'm going to just follow up. Sure, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Noela, a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a Uruguayan. It is
You're
the case
the top,
to say,
you're the top rank.
but half Brazilian, half Uruguayan. Okay. Well, my question is about. I think that the quality of democracy is pretty much linked to the quality of citizenship, and in fact, you mentioned two points in which we are advancing, which are political rights for citizens, and in a more complicated way, educational attainments. But you didn't put a lot of emphasis in the way that Latin America is advancing towards a more equal distribution in economical terms. So I think that this affects a lot the quality of democracy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Diego, and thank you, all of you. I'd like to respond briefly to some of these points. With respect to the point from the gentleman from Panama, I agree completely. There is actually a very interesting body of work, which for some reason we don't cite here, done at the University of Salamanca in Spain by Manuel Alcántara and his group about the quality of politicians. Alcántara insists that the quality of democracy depends a lot on the quality of politicians, and he and his group have spent a great deal of time studying who are the politicians in Latin America, where do they come from, what interests do they, what qualifications do they have, what interests do they pursue, and how do they group together. I also fully agree on the question of elections, and in fact, in most of the studies here and in our own work, we don't simply begin and end with the day of the vote. It is important that voting be free and that the counting be appropriate, but one wants to know the context of elections. One of the case studies in this volume, the one on Venezuela, spends a great deal of time looking in detail at the conditions of elections from 2006 to 2009, since it was published in 2010, and details the tremendous inequality in the use of public resources, access to information, the government control of the media. The government doesn't control the media, but the government presence in the media is much higher. Goes into a great deal of detail on the conditions that surround election up to the point of the vote, so that we don't just content ourselves with the vote, and I agree completely that we cannot do that. With respect to the question of don't outputs matter, well, that's a kind of a leading question. Of course they matter, and they certainly matter in extreme cases. I mean, if a government repeatedly and over a long period of time never delivers, things get repeatedly worse and worse. For some groups, it's undoubtedly the case that grave problems will arise for this government. If it's a democratic government, graver problems will arise. What's interesting to me about this wave, I never know exactly which wave of democracy it is. People like to talk of the third wave, is that these democracies that we now see came into being in the middle of severe economic downturns, and many of them have in fact survived economic crises that would have scuttled regimes very quickly earlier on. That says something both about the discrediting of authoritarian alternatives, the discrediting of the military in particular, in some cases like Argentina most notably, and the relative strengthening of other points. I would never say that outcomes don't matter. We are, however, trying to make a different case, looking strictly at political questions. So yes, of course they matter. And it is, I suppose you could argue, it's a single disciplinary performance, although I think that's a little harsh. We do look at a variety of indicators that are not political, such as education and access to information in the press. But I take your point, and in fact, our main focus is on the political side. And for some of us, it's going back to our origins. It's where I started. And it was interesting to me to re-engage these questions after being interested in something quite different for a long time. On the question of indicators, and the question of sovereignty, I agree completely with the critiques of indicators. The indicators that gave me the most problem are the indicators of accountability. It's very hard, very difficult to come up with satisfactory indicators, and most of them are indirect, as Diego has pointed out. The most unsatisfactory indicator for me is the one of societal accountability. They're all indirect. I think that we have in fact tapped into reality because our indicators do match up with other things that we know from cases. But José and I spent a long time trying to find better indicators, and this is what we came up with. That's about all I can offer in defense. It's very difficult to find good, easily manipulable, scalable indicators, and all scalable indicators are artificial to some extent. I mean, you're turning a very complicated historical process into something which is numerically ranked, and some of them are just not as suitable to that as others, and I think accountability is one of those, although I do agree completely that should there ever be another edition of this book, and who knows, José and I might be animated to do that, the issue of the state capacity more generally would make perfect sense as part of both the accountability indicator and the sovereignty indicator. There was one other point that I wanted to respond to, if I can read my handwriting. Oh, violence, on the violence indicator in Colombia. Well, you know, Colombia is the place where the term la violencia just became a standard term of everybody knows what they're talking about when they talk about la violencia. So I wouldn't just call it drug trafficking. I could think in Colombia, as the author of this piece on Colombia, who's a young woman who has studied Colombia, her argument is that violence in Colombia is a three-cornered fight, right? On the one hand, there are armed groups of the right and left, and she looks at the guerrilla movement. She looks at the so-called autodefensa. I can't remember what their specific name is for the moment. There's the UAC, that's AUC. AUC, there's the various guerrilla movements who have been badly battered lately. And there's a new book out which actually looks at the Rafael Reyes files in great detail, detailing their support. That's one side, the drug traffickers are another side, and then the state is another side. So I think that the violence is more generalized than just the drug traffickers, although it's very clear that in Colombia, as in Mexico now, the violence associated with the drug business really is tremendously undermining, not only of state security and of values of law, but of life and limb in ordinary circumstances. There's an awful lot of people killed just by stray bullets here and there. So I agree with you completely that violence is a tremendous problem. And in other cases, and we don't deal with it enough, in other cases, as I heard Cindy Arnson in a forum here a couple of weeks ago, and I read her congressional testimony, the degree of ordinary violence, the degree of youth violence, the number of people just murdered by the police or gravely injured by police is startling in Latin America, and it hasn't really declined. And the degree of police impunity in ordinary circumstances not related to drug trafficking and gang violence and police murders of people that don't get punished is quite a shameful index. So I think the whole question of violence is bigger than drug trafficking, although drug trafficking in some cases is an extremely important part of it. Those are the points I wanted to make. See if there's anything else here.
Sandy, can I?
Sure, Diego.
Just a brief comment on the question by Richard Feinberg. Outputs matter, of course they matter, and quality of democracy matter, of course it matters. I think the important thing here is that you can, first, these are two different things. Second, they are related because the quality of democracy is an indispensable component of good policies, and good policies will bring about good outputs. So you will not have good democratic performance with bad quality democracy. I mean, it doesn't work. You have to have a good quality democracy, accountability, an appropriate scheme of separation of power between the different branches of government, etc. So these are different but interrelated, and you cannot advance in democratic performance without at the same time addressing the deficits in the quality of democracy.
But it's quite possible to have high rankings on your quality of democracy and have poor performance.
Right.
Well, could you cite a country? Look at the ranking. What? I don't see. I have the ranking here.
It's certainly theoretically
Theoretically
there.
possible.
I think that Diego is right. I mean, every country has bad policies and good policies.
But
I
overall,
think on the whole, it hasn't. The countries that we cite as having higher quality of democracy, in fact, most people would agree, although we're not doing that their policies have been pretty good on the whole. And we're not into policy analysis here.
There's a long discussion about you establishing causality then?
That was Diego who
I was
gave us causality.
Oh yeah, but
I did not.
I just made a presentation on this on Friday, but this is not the time to address it. But I will invite you to talk about it at another time, and I will show you it is that way.
Did Aníbal Pinto from the UNDP make it to Washington? I just want to comment that the recent studies, a couple people have alluded to it, by the United Nations Development Program and the OAS, point precisely to these questions of inequality, poverty and inequality, and the lack of citizen security and the presence of organized crime as the principal threats to not only the quality of democracy but democratic governance. So that there's a whole. The report also deals heavily on questions of stateness and on the quality of the exercise of political power. So I mean, a lot of the issues that we're discussing are very much part of the debate. Let me go around here. Let's hear. Why don't we start with Joan and Ginny, and we'll continue around this side of the table.
Joan Nelson, American University. I want to weigh in on the discussion of accountability and performance. Dan Levine has already remarked that he's least happy or regards as most problematic the indicators of accountability, and several people have mentioned stateness. At one point in your presentation, you mentioned very hastily the executive lacks the resources to do the job. And I'm not sure I caught that correctly, and from your expression, maybe I didn't. But I just, it is terribly important, it seems to me, to distinguish the stateless issues, human and institutional resources, economic resources that permit performance from measures to restrict choice or information, because right after mentioning not doing the job, you mentioned restraints on the media. That seems to me a really a very different kind of thing. And perhaps in working with this whole bag of issues, one might get quite a lot of mileage out of separating out accountability from state capacity. And a footnote on the debt and sovereignty issue, if countries that borrow use the funds well, it may indeed improve capacity, and this may feed back in positive ways, and there are some examples of that. So the debt issue is problematic. Ginny?
Thanks very much. I'm Ginny Bouvier at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I want to go back to the question of sovereignty as well. It's a category that really, and a variable that really fascinates me, and I want to hear more about the way that you've developed the indicators on it. In particular, I think the question of indebtedness seems problematic to me as well, particularly if you think about democratic or elected governments in this last wave of democratization inheriting huge debts from former military authoritarian governments. So it seems that there has to be kind of a lot of nuance in how you might interpret this question of indebtedness as related to democratic performance or democratic procedures. Also, I'm wondering to what extent your sovereignty indicators look at kind of the historical baggage of U.S. hegemony over Latin American decisions. So I'm thinking of things like votes in the United Nations, where you have seen greater independence in the last years of Latin American nations voting differently than the U.S., where in the past maybe you saw more votes with the UN. I guess that I'd just like to hear more about what your indicators are and how you're measuring sovereignty issues.
Front here, pass it around.
The quality of democracy has certainly a lot to do with the quality of institutions. And this begins with the separation of power, and certainly with the independence of the judiciary. I wonder whether you have give any thought to that, because it has to do with accountability. And in some countries of Latin America, presidents have a too strong saying in the appointment of judges, even the judges of the Supreme Court, and this again negatively affects the accountability and positively impact a negative thing, the politicization of justice.
I'd like to put another question on the table, and then we'll go back to Sergio in the back. Because one of the functions of the Wilson Center is to try to bridge the scholarship that you've done with the world of public policy, and there are a number of practitioners in the room. I'm wondering if you could suggest some of the things that need to be done, even better, how to do them in terms of strengthening and improving the quality of democracy and of democratic governance. I mean, obviously institutions are key, but having a roadmap for how to do that in the face of organized crime, in the face of violence, how you train police in the face of corruption. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the practical implications of what you've written about. And then let's take one last question and then return to Dan. Sergio Vitar in the back.
Cindy, thank you. It's on the line that you...
I'm sorry, could you start again? I'm sorry.
The same line that Cindy mentioned. My question is, with all what you have studied, and taking into consideration that Latin America looks very decently for the next years in terms of its economy, what would you indicate as the main priorities that governments in Latin America or parties should follow in order to improve democracy?
Well, I might as well start with these last two. I am absolutely notorious among my colleagues for my lack of interest in public policy. I think I was born to be an academic, and I tend not to, I never work for the government. I never get involved in public policy schemes. I figure I'm just a provider of input, but having said that, I respect people who are interested in public policy. I think it's very important to do. I just know I'm not the person to do it. I think there are some areas, and let me just say something quickly. I'm no expert in making a public policy, but I think a lot of things that can be done, some of them are official and some of them are under the radar. I know some people who work at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I reviewed some of the programs that they did. I reviewed some of their fellows, and I think a lot of stuff that can be done in public policy is under the radar. What I mean by that is I was amazed to see the range of little groups that the National Endowment supports. Groups that promote voter registration, groups that promote education and human rights, groups that promote education for police, for example. All of those things are under the radar of large-scale public policy, but I think they have a significant impact, partly because they create an agenda and partly because they help people who can make that agenda effective in a society survive and consolidate into groups and meet one another. I think that is one area. The second, the other two biggest areas to me, particularly in the area of accountability, are judiciaries, which are weak. I'm not even going to talk about penal systems, which are a horror, but judiciaries which are weak, and I think there are ways that judiciaries and international judiciary systems could be supported, and some of that's not just us. There is the Andean Commission of Jurists played a noteworthy role in the last years of the Fujimori regime, so there are regional groups that could also be supported here. Judiciaries, and I'm a big believer in freedom of information. I think anything which will support freedom of press and freedom of information and support journalists and the kinds of things that they do, both print journalists and others, are a priority that should be pursued. I'm not a big, I think it probably has some effect, but I always have a skeptical air to, I have a skeptical attitude towards programs to train the police better. I mean, and I have a skeptical attitude towards human rights programs with militaries. I'm one of those people who believe that militaries exist to kill people. I mean, that's what they like to do. That's what they're there for. And so I think it's good to work with them and to try to train them better, but I'm not very sanguine about the results of that. Where was there? Wait a minute. Here we are. In terms of the indicators, I agree completely with some of the things that have been said here about indicators. I did not say, I heard what you said, Ms. Nelson, about the executive lacks the resources to do the job. It's not something I would write. But what I think I meant was that those organizations like ombudsmen, attorneys general, legislative oversights, they often don't have the resources to allow them to do the things which their formal charge provides for them to do. I think you're absolutely right that accountability has to be, to that has to be added a measure of state capacity, and that needs to be separated from the question of other things that constrain choices. One is the more general things that constrain choices. The other is whether people can do the job. And in fact, here again, from my limited reading of the literature on social movements and civil society, many of the groups which have done the most to press human rights or corruption charges have been civil society groups. If you look at Argentina, it's groups of lawyers. It's not the official institutions. And those groups can also be strengthened. In fact, they are strengthened in some ways. With respect to sovereignty, I agree that with the things that Virginia Bouvier has said about the debt is inherited. It's also inherited here, unfortunately. We do not look at UN votes and independence for the U.S. We only look internally, although I think what you raise is an important point. I think I've responded to all of these to the extent possible. I'm sorry about public policy. I'm just not a good person to ask about public policy. But as I say, I do believe a lot goes under the radar here. And there's a lot more than what formal governmental action does. And those are areas which can easily be strengthened and which are, in fact, strengthened. You know, if I talk to my lefty friends in Latin America, they say, oh, the National Endowment for the Democracy is just an effort to penetrate and spy on groups. And I say, do you actually know what the National Endowment for Democracy does? And most of them have no idea. And I had no idea until I actually went and looked. It's quite a remarkable range of relatively small-scale efforts, which together, I think, do help constitute and promote civil society under very difficult conditions. One of the hardest things about the relation of civil society to democracy, I wrote a paper a few years ago with a Peruvian friend on disempowerment as the future of empowerment. And why is it that there's so much activism and so little empowerment? And what we concluded was that one of the biggest problems that civil society groups face is gaining reliable, endurable connection to institutions. It's very difficult. The institutions don't care on the whole unless they're made to care. The legal connections, the things don't fit very well. One way to change that is to strengthen the civil society side, to strengthen regional governments also, to strengthen local and regional governments. All of that, I think, is an important part of the solution. And as I say, if you look through the chapters in this book, one thing which we don't talk about in general, we talk about it somewhat, but some of the chapters do more, is about what are the realities of decentralization and municipalization. Decentralization can, of course, simply reproduce old hierarchies in a new way, right? Simply just empower local elites to run things. So one wants decentralization to also come along with an opening up of local and regional institutions. And in some cases, as I suggested, I believe is the case in the Bolivian case, that's really happened, and that's made a difference. The author of the chapter on Bolivia is a lot less sanguine now than he was when he wrote this book about Bolivia. But nonetheless, I'm impressed with the arguments that he's made here. And decentralization is, of course, being, what's the word to put, overturned in Venezuela to a startling degree. What we have is re-centralization and hyper-centralization in the person of the president rather than decentralization. And even when, as it says in here, even when opposition politicians do win elections, often they find their office effectively disappearing in the face of a government by decree. And that's the last point I'll make. Point that I can't remember who made it. The point about decree powers and the use of decree powers is a very important point. We don't count that here. We should, and perhaps we will in another issue. But the use of decree powers and general enabling laws, which allow governments to work without legislative sanction, executives to work without legislative sanction, is, I think, fundamentally undemocratic process. You can see it in an emergency, but it ought to be something highly limited in time and space. And that's all I'll say.
We have time, I think, for about 2 more questions, if there are any other comments or points that people feel that they need to raise. Let's take this gentleman here and then in the back, and then we'll...
Miguel Carter, American University. I want to thank Dan and Diego for not only the excellent presentation, but excellent review of all the questions raised thus far. I would like to sort of go back to the question that was raised earlier and allude perhaps to the broader picture, which is this. To what extent does the quality of a society, the quality of citizenship rights, particularly the whole question of inequality, affect the quality of democracy? And is there some of this explored in the book? Do you think it's another venue that needs to be explored further, and so on? Thank you.
Miguel, and one more here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy, for the invitation and the exposition. Yesterday, I went to a meeting. They were discussing the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And one of the issues that they raised was there should be more emphasis on defending democracy, the lack of democracy of special emergency situations with democracy before that happens, because before those situations happen. And they mentioned this concept of alteration of democracy, the danger to alter democracy. I think that concept, it's very well linked to what we have been discussing here about the quality of democracy. But my question is, what do you think about the possibility, the feasibility that the Inter-American Democratic Charter may play a role in strengthening democracy in the Americas? Thank you.
Well, with respect to the first that Miguel Carter has raised about inequality, we do deal with inequality here somewhat, probably not as much as some people would like us to. I think there's no question that, let me put it this way, the last class I taught on Latin American politics, the very last one I will ever do since I'm not teaching anymore, students said to me, what's the big problem for Latin America? And I said, well, if you had asked me 20 years ago, I would have said violence is the problem. Now I would say inequality is the problem. I mean, quite apart from the what underlies many of the effectiveness and the meaningfulness of many of the issues of democratic participation is persistent inequality. In some places it's much worse than others. And in some places within some countries it's much worse than others. And I think it's what underlies dangers to democracy, mostly because of the way in which it constrains and restricts citizen participation. It undermines the quality of citizenship. It's not that poor people don't have ideas and don't want to participate and can't be good citizens, but there are only so many hours in the day and only so many things that anyone can do. And one of the ironies of this, as it was in my notes and somehow I skipped over it, but it is pointed out in the book, many of the neoliberal reforms that were instituted in the 90s and the early part of this millennium were intended to promote individual participation. But in an ironic twist, they've tended to gut individual participation because they've tended to remove functions from government and remove places where groups would go to lobby for redress of grievances to do things. So individual participation has been increasingly restricted to the vote. There's just not much else for them to do, and that's a weaker form. It's a good form of participation, we all do it, but it isn't the most powerful or the only one. So I think that inequality remains the important question, along with the question of the quality of politicians, which was raised earlier. With respect to the Inter-American Democratic Charter and its use, you know, it's one of those great cases that points up debates over the meaning of democracy. Venezuela is a country I spend a lot of time in and on, and since the government of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela has refused to participate in this because they don't like the way democracy is defined. According to them, democracy should be participativo y protagónico. I've never understood exactly what the protagónico part means. They don't like definitions of democracy which are only concerned with representative democracy. The word representative does not appear in the 1999 Constitution in Venezuela. And they have refused to participate in this. They also don't like the idea of intervention to protect democracy in special emergency situations because they don't like it. They don't want to be intervened on. There was some breath of that in the great crises, which lasted from 2002 to about 2004 in Venezuela. The attempted coup in 2002, and then the recall referendum in 2004, the OAS and the Carter Center, and everybody and his brother were busy in Venezuela in a whole range of totally failed mediation. I don't want to insult anyone here from the U.S. Institute of Peace, but all those efforts were just didn't do anything. And I've looked at them in great detail. So I think that this intervention has had some important consequences. They did play an important role in Peru. In the difference in the role that the OAS played in Peru in 2000 from what they played in Venezuela in 2002 is quite startling. So I think there is a potential role to play there, but it's a very weak instrument, in fact. It's hard for me to imagine the OAS sending jets the way NATO has sent jets into Libya, sending jets into Honduras to overdo, they don't have any jets to send, but sending jets to undo the military coup. It's hard for me to imagine, but I think it's an instrument of political pressure. It's a good one. It has played some roles which are important to play. But in some cases they have, as they say in Venezuela, they han botado la bola. There's a phrase in a Venezuelan song which says, botaste la bola. You kicked the ball, you didn't, and this isn't soccer they play baseball. So when you kick the ball in baseball, it's not a good play. So I think it's a very variable instrument, in fact, in its factual use. Although I think the general idea of defense of democracy, if people can agree on what that means, is a good idea. So that's the last thing I'd say.
Diego, do you want to say one last word? Or?
No, I think Dan closes very well.
Okay, before asking you to join me in thanking Dan and Diego for a wonderful discussion, I want to mention 2 upcoming events of the Latin American program. Next Monday, we'll be joining with the Organization of American States to look at the question of citizen security, which is the theme of the upcoming General Assembly of the OAS in El Salvador in June. And then on May 24th, we'll be looking at questions of taxation, fiscalidad, and inequality, continuing, I think, on some of these aspects of the quality of democracy. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cindy.